welcome to episode 6 of the Badass House webinar series. This is the final and probably most important episode in the series where I explored what it would take to, build, imagine, design, and collaborate on a badass house. And I'm now have the pleasure of welcoming Nick Lockett, who's the partner at Billet Construction, to talk to us about the different procurement options we have and what those implications are, because the way it's traditionally being done in South Africa often sets us up for failure, and building that dream can turn into a nightmare. But before I go into the presentation, someone asked me on social media, well, what on earth is badass? And so for that person or anybody else, I put up my definition. So it's when design works really hard and you solve a bunch of tricky problems. And that encompasses how you contract a house, like how do you procure it and how do you work with a bunch of people from different backgrounds and different needs. And in this context, badass means it's a rigorous process of working through all the challenges to end up with an outcome that is more than the sum of its parts. I mean, that's what we're really aiming for. And so this is a critical clue of the puzzle that Nick is going to not explain to us. He's not going to tell us how it works. He's going to allude to it because it's complicated. And obviously, after this presentation, you can get hold of Nick and he can tell you more. We'll also have this as a resource. And I'm also thinking of making a little download flyer pamphlet that summarizes Nick's presentation, because it's really well worked out and well considered. And there you can see an image of it. And this is also stuff I've shared with Nick in order to kind of engage in a conversation around how such a house, which is fairly large and has some complicated aspects to it, would be procured. For those of you who don't know, so you're going to read this image in reverse, but we always look at the pretty picture. That's why this the sequence is kind of in reverse, but you can see generally building a project is divided in 6 stages, and Nick will go into those. But as an easy illustration, if you start bottom right, you don't really design anything in that stage. The next one is concept, then develop the design. You would want a consultant team there, and we will discuss with Nick of bringing in the contractor earlier on in the project, and then the technical documentation, and then construction starts stage 5, but a critical thing here is tender between 4 and 5, which Nick will explain more to us about. So with that, I hand over to Nick.
Thank you very much for having me. So my name's Nick Lockett. I'm a partner at Billet Construction. It's a company my partner and I started off in 2009. Most of my background before starting Billet was spent overseas. Largely in the UK, a number of different regions in the UK, and we then moved to the Middle East. A lot of my career has been spent in the Middle East. And then when I came back to South Africa, I just decided to start practicing what I preached. So my presentation today really tackles quite an extensive sort of topic, but I've tried to sort of narrow it down as best as I can. And really, the topics that I'd like to discuss are right in front of you there. But I'd like to start with risk. So I think most people conceive the process of construction as being a very risky process. It's largely filled with controversy, and it really ought not to be. And so really you've got to get to the basis of what risk really is. And risk really is a byproduct of uncertainty. The more you reduce uncertainty, the more you're ultimately going to reduce risk. And so risk really falls into 2 kind of categories. It falls into internal factors and external factors. The internal factors are largely at your control. And I can discuss those a bit later on. And I think as we go through the presentation, those things will become more and more apparent. External risks are largely out of our control. And so if I give you a typical example, it's really the reason why all of us are so familiar with Zoom right now, and it's the thing called COVID-19. Those are things that you cannot control. Those are external risks. Other examples of external risks would certainly in South Africa would be things like the rate of exchange, rate of inflation, certain labor laws, certain statutory obligations, things like that. Those are largely out of our control. It's important to understand that risk can never be eliminated, but it can always be reduced. And you reduce risk by making the uncertain more certain. Mm. And to end off on this particular topic, risk can always be transferred between parties, and it can be shared between parties. And so ultimately where you always want to get to is a win-win situation between all parties in a contract. And so win-win scenarios are very fair scenarios, and they are very sustainable throughout a project. The next sort of alternative you would have is when risk is slightly imbalanced, and so where one party is at slightly more of a benefit than another party. And generally those are unfair scenarios between separate contracting parties. They're unfair and they're also unsustainable. And a lot of construction contracts that result in dispute are typically where risk distribution is not well aligned. And then the last scenario is really a lose-lose situation. And believe it or not, those are actually fair. Both parties don't benefit, but also they are unsustainable kind of arrangements. So to summarize, really what you always want to target on projects is to always have win-win scenarios that are fair and sustainable. So I think a lot of people joined into this conversation will be very familiar about what's being discussed here. So project parameters really are there are components that really gauge performance of a project, and they're really split into three categories. You will have cost, and you'll have quality and time. And generally speaking, they work largely in opposites, especially when you couple two of them together. So a lot of people will argue or say that, you know, if you want a high quality project and you want it delivered quickly, it's going to be expensive. If you want a high quality project at a low cost, it's generally going to be quite slow to deliver. And if you want a low cost and fast project, generally you're going to compromise on quality. And so really at the middle of that whole scenario, I've drawn a question mark. And my question mark is really, what is that question mark? And so in a perfect scenario, if you bring all of these bubbles together and condense them, you won't really have them fighting against each other, and you will have a project that's delivered on time to perfect quality and absolutely within budget. The reality is in life that's never going to happen. So what do you want to do? You always want to tend towards bringing those bubbles together. And so the question mark in satisfying bringing those bubbles together is what I would like to call utility or value. And generally that's controlled by the whole project team at large. And so whenever you deploy a project, it's very, very, very important to understand exactly what the client's requirements are very, very, very early on in terms of cost, quality, and time.
So Nick, just to jump in there, I've recently learned, so I'm learning about sales, and a lot what happens in sales is you ask questions, and that is in order to determine what's actually going on. Like, sure. Why are people making certain demands? And we often don't do that because we just fall into the schemata of it, the traditional way, especially with public works. I mean, it's very set.
Sure. Look, I mean, I think that really sort of bringing this sort of slide to an end, I think it's very, very, very important to understand that throughout the project kind of journey, you always need to make sure that all of these components are consistently aligned. Never allow one component to run ahead of the other, because you're going to always put one of those parameters at risk or far behind, and one of them will always be sacrificed. So the key here really is coordinated efforts throughout the project life cycle in the management of cost programming and quality management. Very important. So when you take into consideration risk and you take into consideration project parameters, you end up at something that's called procurement. Okay? And procurement is really just a fancy word for buying. And more specifically, this slide is about construction procurement systems. So really what it is a fancy word for saying, how do you buy construction? So you generally have three predominant procurement systems which are in existence. The one that we're most familiar with, certainly here in South Africa and in home building, is the traditional procurement system. Okay. The other two procurement systems, which are largely in existence, are design and build procurement systems. A lot of people here would know them as turnkey construction projects. And the very last one that you have is management contracting or construction management. Very much the same sort of thing. So traditional procurement systems are generally carried out under three cost disbursement arrangements. The first would be a lump sum arrangement. And a lump sum arrangement is a fixed price contract. That price does not change unless there are scope changes that are driven outside of the contractor's discretion. The second, the second cost reimbursement or payment mechanism under a traditional procurement system is a remeasurable contract, and so that's typically where you would have bill of quantities, and the quantum is subject to change, but the rates associated with those particular bill items are fixed. And then the third that you do have is a cost reimbursement arrangement where quite simply a fee and an overhead recovery is established, and then all direct costs associated with the contract are paid at cost. So those are synonymous with traditional procurement systems. Design and build or turnkey type arrangements, they are generally associated with lump sum fixed prices. And management contracting is largely associated with cost reimbursement. And we'll go into these in the following slides. So there's one more type of procurement system which is involved here, which is generally a hybrid. And I put a question mark because hybrid procurement system can really be a concoction of all types of traditional or established procurement systems that we know or understand of, and they can also be also involve very complex payment type systems. They're generally hybrid systems, and their crudest forms are quite harshly concocted arrangements that, again, don't necessarily distribute risk very equally between contracting parties and can be very dangerous to use. The lighter kind of form of hybrid type arrangements would be slight modifications of your more well-established procurement systems, such as the traditional design and build or management contract. So the traditional type of procurement system is what we are mostly familiar with around the world, especially in South Africa, and with specific reference to residential construction. So traditional procurement systems are an arrangement where a client will employ all of the design team and consultants, and then will also engage separately with the contractor. So the contractor bears no responsibility for design and is only responsible for the work. Generally, traditional procurement systems are used where there is an impetus on a reliance on a fairly high level of cost certainty before works commence. And generally speaking, traditional procurement systems have a large impetus on quality. And generally speaking, that's at the detriment of time. So traditional procurement systems in the overall project life cycle are a lot longer in duration than other forms of procurement. So some of the advantages of traditional procurement is that it's tried and tested, and the market's very familiar with it. Price certainty is a big component as well. And so those are probably, in a traditional aspect, I would say, some of the strengths of a traditional procurement system. Obviously, quality as well. Some of the disadvantages with traditional procurement systems, and I'll speak about these in a little minute, is that they are very, very, very dependent on a very high level of design completeness before the construction is commenced. A lot longer than other procurement systems. And one of the biggest faults, which I feel, is that the contractor really is only involved in the project purely for the construction remit. They are very seldom involved in the initial stages of design and design development. More particularly, what we see in South Africa is that when a lot of these projects go out to market or out to tender, price certainty is very, very, very much dependent on completeness of construction documentation. And we find here in South Africa that a huge amount of the design process, especially the detailed design, is actually not complete on the assembly of the construction documentation. And so really you have a very large component of the bill of quantities that you're expecting price that's provisional. And the fact that it's provisional means that it hasn't been completely designed, it hasn't been specified. And as a result of that, the price certainty that's generally synonymous with traditional procurement systems, especially here in South Africa, is largely eroded. So going down to some of the points that I've indicated below, traditional procurement systems are very sequential. So they are very much dependent on preceding stages being complete. What we see here in South Africa is that the construction documentation is very much dependent on bills of quantities, which are often used as a specification, but are generally quite inaccurate in actually describing and specifying the work that's required. Again, another item that I find that is quite complex, especially with our traditional procurement systems and these large provisional sums and work and designs not being resolved early on in the process, is a very gray area with regard to design portion, specifically relating to very specialized kind of elements. Who does that design responsibility rest with? And that really comes down a lot of the time to very specialized building components and very specifically building services that are generally outside of your typical architect's remit.
Nick, and then give us a quick example of one of those in a house.
So let me, one item that we've come up with quite often is performance criteria with certain building services. So we've had a project quite recently where a client, we installed, in all of our houses, we have hot water ring mains. So your hot water is absolutely there on demand. The hot water is circulated through the house consistently. So when you turn on a bath, you've got hot water within 5 seconds. I had a scenario where a client had said to me, well, I was expecting everywhere in my house to get hot water within 15 seconds, but there's a particular bathroom where I'm getting hot water within about 30 seconds. What's going on? And a lot of it came down to the expense of having to install an extensive ring main for a bathroom that was really, really, really far out in the house. It was a guest bathroom. And the capital expense, in our opinion, never justified that. But the client said, well, was I ever consulted on that? And our argument ultimately was, well, did you ever tell us that you needed hot water within 15 seconds strictly in every single bathroom? So, and there are many, many, many different scenarios like that. what you will often find in those performance criteria is that they generally relate to building services and building fabric and performance to weather considerations. So those are the main components that we come across. Last thing that I wanted to mention there is that we've come across many tenders in the past where there has been a very lean professional component in terms of the design development and going out to tender. So we've bid on projects before. We've asked for the project outcome, and the principal agent has turned around to us and said, "Well, it's great. This is how you fared in the bidding process, but unfortunately, all of the costs that have come in are about 50% over budget." Which means that there was no cost planning, there was no accurate cost estimating done before tender. And as a result of that, the designers are quite a precarious situation. You know, they've got to do a lot of value engineering. Is it their cost to wear? Is it the client's cost to wear? Who knows? So let's move on to the next slide, please. So Thorsten had actually provided me insight into the McLeany curve, which is actually quite an interesting document to look at. So there are two linear lines there, and I think that everyone can appreciate the fact that if you implement design changes later on in a project, the costs associated with those design changes become exponentially higher. And so the one thing that is synonymous with traditional procurement systems is that the design work or the design information flow is very late in the process. And so you often find yourself in a situation where adjusting or manipulating or changing certain design consideration once you've facilitated the construction process become very costly to implement. And not only in terms of cost, but also in terms of impacting overall project duration. And so what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years is many different procurement systems have been advocated to try and really reel in the design development process to much earlier on. So you really have the ability to do far more designing off-site and on paper rather than implementing certain design changes in the field.
Do you like my annotations?
Yes.
Color all of those. There we go. That's the bloodbath, Nick. Make it happen earlier than later, right?
100%. You know, it's just it's always about again, like I was saying, risks are always associated with uncertainty. So do all the homework you can to rid your procurement cycle of uncertainty. It's all about thinking and planning ahead.
And this is important, right? This is where things usually get tendered out, where the, you know, procurement,
yeah, absolutely,
the construction process.
Absolutely. So, so this graph is really drawn on the strict regime of traditional procurement, which assumes that the construction documentation is very largely complete before you go out to tender, which is your arrow. The reality in South Africa, you can move that pink curve where the apex of that pink curve is exactly in the middle of that procurement chain. And that's your provisional sum. Exactly. Those are your provisional sums. So I received numerous tenders where you can quite literally anticipate what the projected contract value is going to be by literally doubling the provisional sums. And so what that really tends to do is it creates an enormous bottleneck and pressure on design resolution and having to do that in tandem with a very complex stage, which is stage 5, which is construction. So really what we want to be able to do is pull a lot of that legwork design back to the earlier stages. And what we find certainly here in South Africa is that there are a couple of dependencies there. It's largely based on the client's ability to be able to make informed design decisions to release those designs earlier on, and also the access of the design team to certain specialist trades to be able to facilitate concluding those designs.
Yeah.
So I spoke briefly earlier on about the other forms of procurement systems. So design and build procurement systems or turnkey procurement systems, your level of comparison here largely, they relate very often to commercial type projects. A lot of the time in fit out of office spaces, in certain creations of franchise shops, things like that. And really the design and build mechanism is where the design team and the contractor are one entity, and the client really contracts only with that single entity. They very seldomly, a client won't employ a separate design team or consultant. They may employ an agent to act on their behalf, which may be a design specialist or a project manager. So design and build systems generally are synonymous with projects that are very much functional rather than prestigious. And so you don't very often see design and build principles being adopted in complex house building. But there are variances to that, and we'll discuss those in a bit. The other thing, the other things that are synonymous with design and build, there is a very high degree of cost certainty, and there is a high degree of cost certainty because the contractor and the design team are one entity. And those projects generally, because of that level of overlapping and being able to get the contractor involved very early in the process, or the design and build contractor, time is generally at their advantage. So their real strengths in design and build are cost certainty and time. Management contracting is very, very, very different, and they are very much associated with very, very, very large, complex construction projects. Management contracting generally has one impetus, and their impetus is to be able to deliver those projects as quickly as possible. So they generally have association with very large commercial projects and infrastructure projects. And the other component that goes hand in hand with delivering very quickly, quite funny enough, can either be cost and or can be quality. But the predominant feature in management contracting is the speed at which they're contracted and built out. And so what's quite important that I've noted at the bottom there is that they have very effective cost control mechanisms, but they don't necessarily yield a cheap price.
Okay. But it's predictability then what you got.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then we touch lastly on the hybrid kind of versions. And hybrid versions really should only be adopted when where your parameters or your construction or design considerations are very, very, very complex, and you cannot find a procurement system that ultimately suits those. So hybrid procurement systems are generally, when they're quite convoluted, are generally adopted by clients and professionals that have generally worked quite often in the past before, and they are very, very, very well versed with the risks associated with adopting hybrid procurement systems. Another form of hybrid procurement systems that generally kind of work when you don't convolute the process are slight alterations or modifications to existing procurement systems that are already in existence. So I'll give you a very good typical example. Overseas, we have done a number of design and build projects where the client has contracted a design team, and really they've contracted them directly to really work extensively to detail the client's design brief and to really work through stage 1 and 2. And that's your sort of concept and schematic sort of stage of the project. And once they feel satisfied that they have, that the design team have captured exactly what they want in terms of the build, They will then novate that entire design team to the contractor to adopt them into their construction remit and build it under a design and build remit. So that's a particular mechanism that's very largely adopted overseas. Another mechanism which is quite pertinent to points in discussion are two-stage appointments. And a two-stage appointment is typically where a client is prepared to forego a certain level of expense to engage a contractor very early on in the design development process to assist the design team in really refining those designs, to bring in the specialist expertise, to be able to get to a point where a huge degree of uncertainty is really resolved in that detailed design phase. And so two-stage appointment, they will engage a contractor to provide a certain level of services in stage one and a number of deliverables. And on performance and acceptance of those deliverables, the contractor may or may not be appointed for the stage two remit, which is generally the construction.
So, Nick, to jump in there, what you're saying is when the contractor is involved earlier, then what usually ends up as provisional sums, because it's very specialized design, let's say steel work on whatever fancy balustrades, that can then be done earlier on.
Yeah, I mean, you're dead right.
Balustrades, maybe not a good example. Let's say like a fancy kind of passive cooling system.
Correct. So generally, the main contractor would be engaged during the detailed design remit to provide their expertise, to bring in specialists to be able to assist the design team to complete the detailed design process. So more specifically, I mean, you obviously know that we're involved as the main contractor on a very large scheme for Nike. And on that particular scheme, we were brought in, well, we were selected as the preferred vendor for stage one services. And we were involved very, very, very largely to facilitate a lot of the construction drawing remit, to oversee a lot of that, to make sure that we aligned a lot of what would generally be provisional sums throughout that process. And we bid a lot of those packages out through that detailed design process. And eventually we ended at a point at the end of stage one services where our provisional sums on a 50 million Rand contract, I think, were about 500,000 Rand. So to give you an idea, 500,000 Rand versus 25 million, which you would generally see in a traditional procurement aspect, is considerable legwork done. And so our arrangement with Nike at the end of our stage one services was to enter into a lump sum fixed price contract. And yeah, of course, we took a fair amount of risk involved in that. But the client had then a very, very, very high degree of cost certainty. And we really sort of understood quite carefully what our provisional sums consistent of. And our provisional sums really in that process were limited to things that were absolutely well outside of our control, and things that we couldn't determine. So let me give you a typical example. One of our provisional sums was remedial work to existing underground services. We had no idea of the location of certain underground services. The existing historical information was very poor. And so we had extensive civil works. And so any remedial works to existing underground services was an absolute unknown. And that was therefore a provisional sum.
That makes sense.
So what's the kind of relevance? Well, we spoke about this a couple of times, but it's important always at the inception of a project to establish the client's absolute expectation with cost, quality, and time, but most importantly, utility. Okay. And again, I'm going to keep repeating this through slides, and it may become more apparent later on. But when you home build, it's very, very, very important to understand that clients have a very, very, very high impetus on utility and quality. And that's not only about the end product and how the end product functions, how it looks, but also the journey in getting there. So again, I've reiterated in that second point there. Again, a very important component in house building is to try and understand how involved a client really wants to be in the process. You have many, many, many different scenarios. I've had scenarios where the husband has said, you just tell me how much it's going to cost and keep me informed, and I want to know about the technology. My wife will make the rest of the decisions. I don't want to know anything about it. Versus housewives that you would think that would be enormously involved in the process but lose interest after a couple of months, and the husband really runs it as a project as his own. It's very, very, very important to understand how involved a client wants to be and how little they want to be involved. My third point is quite an interesting point, but all clients can become tricky. And so it's very important to understand and to try and establish very early on what buttons you push on a client that turns them tricky and what sort of wins favor with them. It really is a very, very, very unknown. I'm sure we have clients or potential clients listening to this presentation, but it's very, very, very important to be able to open those channels of communication. So you always make sure that you are satisfying exactly what the client really requires. And then lastly, it's very important to understand that when you're home building, you're building somebody's home, and these are completely bespoke articles. These aren't off-the-shelf things. And a lot of the clients that you will deal with draw absolute inference or reference to things that they can get off the shelf. So in terms of cars, luxury products, things like that. When you build their house, it's completely unique. There's never going to be anything like it. And so that sort of component of bespokeness is very, very, very important to understand, especially with house building.
Nick, what would be another word for bespoke? Just because it's such an overused hipster word now.
It's completely custom.
Okay, completely custom, completely unique, very much suited as it's an answer to a bunch of tricky problems that I alluded to in the beginning.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so it's not a copy and paste.
No.
Okay, got you.
So this is quite a populated slide. But when I was putting this presentation together, on a Saturday morning, when there was no disturbance in the house, I pulled up a list of a number of different projects, and I spent probably half an hour or so writing down key aspects that I found in each one of those projects that were pretty much client driven. Okay? I put them all onto a piece of paper, and then I started to split them all out. And I kind of came up with 3 categories. And the first category that I came up with was things that you can really capitalize on in a project. My second category was things to be super aware of. And my third category was about things to very, very, very carefully manage. And again, these are typically client traits, but they are very, very, very consistent. So the first category that I came up with was things to capitalize on. So you've got to understand that these houses that you build, badass houses, big houses, generally the clients that you deal with they are industry leaders. They are individuals that are very senior in blue chip companies. They can be innovators. They can be politicians. The fact of the matter is, all of these individuals, he's or she's, they operate in a business context in very, very, very formal and successful structures. And so it's important to be able to capitalize on how they operate and the environments that they're used to operating in. So it's very important to understand the principles that they adopt and that the principles that they are used to in business that you draw into the project, because you can really capitalize on that. So yeah, things that they are familiar with in business and the way that they operate in business, try and implement those in your project. Client will feel it as a familiar ground, and it will make them very comfortable to operate and capitalize on that. Another big thing that I think is very relevant is esteem. A lot of these individuals take a huge amount of esteem, especially when they've been involved in certain considerations in design, seeing those ideas come to fruition. And it's very, very, very important to promote and facilitate factors that involve clients' esteem and actualization. Very important.
It's also exciting, I suppose, you know?
Yeah, you
Because
know,
it's so physical. This thing is going to be, it stands there, you can be in it.
100%. And, you know, when you've got very, very, very unique aspects of a project, things that haven't been tested before, and they come to fruition and are really successful, the clients gain a huge amount of esteem and actualization out of that. So that's, you've always got to be pushing the boundary on that front. Although a relatively arbitrary kind of thing, housekeeping is enormously important. Clients will very seldom say to you that the site is untidy, but if the site is enormously tidy and very well run, a client will always compliment you on that. And really, you just have to look at complex manufacturing chains that a lot of these clients are involved in. A lot of them in industry operate factories, manufacturing chains where you could eat your supper off the manufacturing floor, and they will really sort of see a level of parallel there in terms of the way that you run your site.
Because I always see burger boxes blowing in the wind all over sites.
Yeah. They won't specifically pick you up about it, but if they don't see any of that around, then they'll compliment you on that.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of how you operate as individuals, as a project team, is very important as well. Displaying an approach of humility, being very open and honest, goes a huge way. Again, you're building their houses. You don't have to operate strictly sort of in a tactical business environment. So they really enjoy displaying elements of humility. Also, your opinion or opinions about certain processes and certain decisions that need to be made goes a long way. And also being able to hold a client's hand is very, very, very important. You know, although you deal with very competent individuals, a lot of them are uncertain about certain things. And so it's important that consistently throughout the process, you hold a client's hand and guide them through that. And the two sort of remaining aspects there that I think are important is that all of the clients that you deal with really understand value for money. And it's not necessarily about the gross value of what they're spending, but always to be able to demonstrate value for money is incredibly important. A lot of the individuals that you'll be building houses for come from backgrounds or come from certain circumstances where they have come from absolute zero to hero. And so they really understand that ability to deliver value and really appreciate it. The last point in this sort of category is really being able to project and forward think, be on your front foot all the time, be able to anticipate things before they arrive. It's enormously important. That's how these guys think. They're going to expect you to think like that. So the second category really is things to be wary of. Generally, I would say here that these are more functions of how you administer a project. The two components I think which are vitally important really is absolute time management all the time. Always keep an eye on schedule, and it's vitally important to facilitating components of cost and quality. The second thing is really about decision making, and a lot of this is driven by the client. A lot of the clients in house building are very particular about aesthetics, and they struggle a lot of the time to make certain decisions on aesthetic content. based on very often having too many options, too many considerations. So very important that you manage that component. And what goes hand in hand with that are, and we'll speak about this a bit later on, is really the management of dependencies and decision making. So a very crude example would be, well, a client can't decide the tiles that they want in a bathroom because they don't know what wallpaper is going to go on the walls. And they don't know what wallpaper is going to go on the walls because they haven't appointed the interior designer. But we need the tiles on site in 4 weeks' time, and the interior designer is not going to be engaged, and the decision's not going to be made in the next 4 weeks. So we've always got to break those dependencies. And one last component, and this is actually quite an important consideration that we come up with quite often on projects, is functionality and ease of functionality. And really this is split into two categories. It's largely a function of services, building services, and the building fabric. So when I talk about building services, it's a lot of the time your specialist subcontractors are very good at promoting or forward selling a very advanced solution. But when it comes down to practically operating that advanced solution, clients become enormously frustrated when something falls over and they don't understand how to remedy it. And it's always at the 11th hour. So it's very, very, very important to make sure that the ease of function of a building is always taken into consideration. And that really happens very much in the design development process rather than the implementation. And then lastly, the things to very, very, very carefully manage. It's important to understand that a lot of us on this webinar are professionals that do this day in and day out. I look at two-dimensional drawings all the time. I always understand from a two-dimensional drawing what the three-dimensional consequence or what the three-dimensional impetus is always going to be. Clients don't have the ability to do that. They really don't. And so through 2D drawings and really a lack of insight into conceptual awareness and three-dimensional spatial awareness, a lot of what happens through the construction process are design changes. I've seen the structure built. Do you know what? I'm not happy with it. Let's change it to this. And so design changes are one thing, but also when it comes to finishes as well, you can have huge limitations there as well, where certain finishes really aren't fit for purpose. And again, we go back to the McLeamy curve, and really implementing those things becomes a very costly and timely exercise later on. So really the ability to transform two-dimensional aspects into concepts, three-dimensional aspects that a client really understands is vitally important.
But Nick, you mentioned like the value you perceive in a kind of 3D digital model in those visualizations.
100%. Like on Nike, we built a 3D model of, I mean, one component of our building there is a 3,000 square meter refurb of an existing space. The cost spent to do the 3D model was minuscule in comparison to the risks that you would face without developing a 3D model. In that particular context, it was very important because it actually allowed our construction crew and related subcontractors to really understand the dynamics of working in a very, very, very restricted, complex Portland steel frame structure. And really the last two topics that I would suggest that you have to very carefully manage, and again, these are quite sort of broad things, but as a delivery team, never oversell to a client. Always make sure that you are very, very, very realistic about what you put forward. And always make sure that the client is absolutely always informed. The first harsh decision that you're going to have with a client will make subsequent harsh decisions very easy to deal with. But if you leave that too long, those discussions become very, very, very difficult to deal with later on. Always engage the client, keep them informed. And again, remember that the client, remember about the personality or the kind of individual you're dealing with in this particular context. These guys, when they request something, they don't normally ask twice. By the time they've asked for the third time, they're frustrated. By the time they've asked for the fourth time, they'll explode. They'll always make sure that you are absolutely on top of exactly what the client wants and always get it resolved.
Nick, what kind of communication methods do you use? I mean, we have the phone, we have email. I find email is the least effective out of all of it.
So you'll see that I've written a point in orange over there, post boxing. That's email.
Okay.
Yeah. So I believe, and I'm going to come to my very last point over here, which is the second last bullet point. I believe that you always have to have a very close relationship with your client, where you're able to pick up the phone, where you're able to send a WhatsApp. And really just being able to communicate with these guys on a very live time basis is very important. But you've got to bear in mind that it really is a mechanism to keep your clients updated, so they are very aware of what's going on. Okay? And my last point bears substance to exactly what I'm talking about: record keeping. Every single one of those conversations you have, an informal site walk around, a WhatsApp or whatever, always make sure that you back up exactly what you've said into a formal context. And it's not only because that may or may not be needed in the instance of a dispute, but if you do maintain very accurate record keeping, you will always navigate your way outside of a potential.
Just say that last thing again. The last thing you said. You will always navigate your way.
If you maintain a very, very, very accurate record of discussions and always confirm to a client after an informal discussion exactly what you've agreed, you will always reinforce those discussions that you've had, and they will always potentially steer you away from anything that would relate to a disagreement about a certain discussion.
Okay. Yeah. So we're on the last subject here, almost. Second last.
Almost.
Yeah.
Almost. And but Thorsten, I'm going to catch you up on that in a minute. Okay. So framework, we haven't even got started yet, but this is how you assemble your framework before you embark. Generally speaking, in the delivery of all construction projects, you need a team leader, and the team leader is not necessarily the client. And in house building, and certainly in South Africa, they would take two forms. Traditionally, it would be the architect acting as a principal agent, and in quite a few instances, the client will appoint a specific project manager. Again, I keep honing on in this, that you always have to establish exactly what the client's parameters are going to be. And once you understand the client's parameters, then you can select and dial in a specific procurement system that suits those parameters.
Okay, your sound is fading a bit, Nick. Your sound is fading in and out. Maybe just speak a bit closer to.
Yeah, and so
great.
Again, I hone in on the aspect of refining and understanding the client's expectations in terms of the parameters. Very important. And again, you will select a procurement system which best suits the parameters the client would enjoy during the project. And then finally, although this is a slightly diluted sentence here, it's not only about identifying the professional team. It's about identifying the professional team. It's about appointing the professional team. And very importantly, it's about configuring the professional team's remit to suit the procurement system you need. So, for example, a typical quantity surveyor's service in a traditional remeasurable contract will be very, very, very different to their level of involvement in a lump sum fixed price. In a lump sum fixed price, their involvement would be far less. Again, it's very important to structure exactly the professional team's level of inclusion in the project dependent on the journey. So really what I've done here is I've explained the different stages of the construction process, which were really mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. And so your first three stages and a large portion of stage number 4 are predominantly design related. And so the bar charts that I've indicated at the bottom really sort of give you an indication of how certain stakeholders are involved in the project and at what stage. And so what's most synonymous about a traditional procurement system is that the principal consultant is obviously engaged since inception. And then the balance of the consultants are generally engaged in stage 2. The main contractor really is only engaged partially in 4.2 and then in stage 5. In contrast, looking again back at the McLeamy curve, the other or alternative procurement systems that promote early main contractor involvement, such as design and build and management contracting, really bring the main contractor in far earlier in the process to really sort of facilitate that detailed design process and really reduction of uncertainty. And that's generally explained exactly what I've mentioned in that slide. So really, the process of delivering the project is a very, very, very involved process. And I'm just going to spell out a number of sort of topics that I think are relevant here. Again, it's a very, very, very complex remit. But I think I will mention here a couple of points that I think. Okay. So I think that the entire construction delivery mechanism is quite a draconian process, especially under traditional sort of arrangements. And so you can really draw a lot of inference or a lot of principles from other management principles that are currently in existence and are quite successful. So a typical example is the 80-20 rule. And so the 80-20 rule really is a principle that 20% of the components really attribute 80% of the value in the project. So focus on those 20% of the components and make those your priority, because if you do, you will be 80% successful. Another thing that I think is quite interesting is a concept called Scrum Technique. And I'd encourage you guys really to read up about it. It's very, very, very interesting. It's predominantly focused around manufacturing and development of product, largely in the industrial space, that has massive inferences to what we do in the construction sector. Very, very, very interesting principles. Read about them. A lot of those principles can be adopted into your delivery. One of the main components that I think is most predominant in the delivery process that you always have to keep an eye out on is time management. And there are a number of components which are associated with this. Always making sure that timeless appointments are made. Always making sure you keep an eye on long lead. And for those of you that don't understand about long lead, things won't arrive at site the next day if you place an order the day before. There's a manufacturing process. If things are being imported, there are shipping duration considerations, all sorts of things like that. So long lead is a very important component to manage. And the two last points involved in that are whole points, and that is really being able to make sure throughout the sequential delivery process, always make sure that you have a stage sign-off before consecutive trades proceed. If you have defective work on a very early work element and you haven't identified all the preceding trades that layer work on top of that become abortive once that defect has become apparent. And also milestones. You've got to make sure that you always hit those milestones and establish those milestones. And it's very important to make sure that you have milestones in a project which are very strong indicators of whether or not you are aligned with program or not aligned with program. Dependencies is a very, very, very complex thing to discuss, but in essence, what you want to do throughout the process is break dependencies. So a dependency is to say, well, I cannot do this because that has not been resolved. and dependencies exist all the time. I gave you an example about the tiling earlier. I can't order the tiling because I don't know about the wallpaper. You get many, many, many examples of dependencies. And so if you read about Scrum Technique, they are very, very, very focused on about breaking dependencies. So a very important thing to consider. The learning curve, why reinvent the wheel? Always try and rely on existing examples, existing principles, things that have been done successfully, things that have been done unsuccessfully. Do your homework. Don't reinvent the wheel. Always cheap and easy to research and do your homework. Don't reinvent the wheel. Speak to people, understand about people who have delivered things successfully, understand how they've done it, incorporate them into your remit.
That's why I'm speaking to you, Nick.
Another component is always making sure that the designers, the cost managers, the engineers, production on site are always aligned. Never allow one thing to run ahead of another. Don't let the designers go crazy designing things and implementing things while cost components haven't been resolved. You always need to make sure that there's a constant alignment and balance between all of those aspects. And again, going back to the parameters, that's what allows us to bring our bubbles together. That's the value or the utility. It's always more cost effective to design on paper than it is in the field. So always make sure the designs are well considered, make sure the designs are well detailed. Avoid site solutions at all costs. An enormously expensive process to start designing in the field. Hold points, stage commissioning are very important. We've touched on it earlier. Always make sure that you're progressively signing off on things. It avoids abortive work later on. The cost of remedial work is huge. Although the onus is borne by the contractor, it will always have an implication on time and the ultimate quality of the project. We've touched on it before, administration and record keeping. It's enormously important. Keep on top of it. But use tools that promote being able to do this easier. We've started working with Nike, and we did it on a very, very, very large residential project here in Sandton, where we were introduced to software called Smartsheet. Smartsheet is an incredibly powerful collaborative software. It's very, very, very easy to use. It's inexpensive to sign up to. And specifically in terms of construction, it allows a lot of the extensions that we have in terms of administration to be adopted. Programming, document control, all those sort of things. So look at it, it's great, it's fantastic to use. Focus always on closing out items. It's vastly important. Always make sure that you have a register of open items and consistently make sure you're closing those things out. And finally, you have statutory obligations, don't ignore them. Council approved drawings, NHBRC requirements. We've been involved in a project in the Western Cape, which was a very long project, about a 3-year-long project, grade 2 listed building, where the heritage considerations are so strict that any design changes need to be very carefully, very, very, very carefully administered. And they're generally a design change on heritage Western Cape buildings, grade 2, grade 1 listed buildings. If you're going to implement a change, it's going to take you 3 or so months to get that approval in place. Don't step outside the box. And heritage Western Cape projects, if you do, you're subject to criminal prosecution. So
yeah, they'll make an example of you to scare everyone else.
All right, we're almost at the end. So realization. Okay. Celebration almost. You've at the end of the project, you're getting close to it. The fact of the matter is, the end of the project, you are always faced with bottlenecks. You've got to relieve yourself of bottlenecks. The two most important components as you're getting towards the end of the project is that you always have to have a very keen eye and keen level of resource focusing on testing and commissioning. The testing and commissioning is ultimately the lifeblood of the building, how the building fabric performs, and it's how the services perform. Make sure you are consistently testing and commissioning. Again, at the end, you can avoid bottlenecks by closing out conclusive areas. If you have rooms that are ready and areas of a building that are ready, always bring those slightly forward, close them out, get them pre-snagged, get locked up. So at the nth hour, you are not contending with an entire building. You are dealing with very limited aspects of the building. Again, I've spoken about it before. Make sure you're on top of all of your statutory obligations. You have to have occupation, certification, etc. in place. Make sure you've got all those certificates. And always make sure that you've engaged the building inspector right from the beginning, because they will ask you, did they ever inspect the drains before you closed out? Got to make sure you're on top of that. Again, operation and maintenance manuals are a very, very, very important aspect. You know, when you go and buy a BMW, you get a fantastic manual that comes in the glove box. And you've got to be able to draw levels of comparison between that manual that's in a glove box of a BMW and a building that you've built that is vastly more expensive than a BMW. So make sure that the manuals and the levels of documentation are there. And then the very last thing, snagging. Ugh, we all hate it, but it's a reality. So snagging is a very important component of a project, and it's very important to distinguish the difference between a snag and a defect. The reality is, if you do not manage the snagging process, you can turn a very successful project, or a project where a client was very happy, to a very unsuccessful project, or a project where a client feels very unhappy. So again, a snag is different to a defect. Okay? A snag is generally something that is very aesthetic, something very easy to resolve. A defect is something with a far heavier underlying issue. Know the difference between the two. And never allow a client to move into a house if defects are apparent. So as a main contractors absolutely understand exactly what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of quality. Never, ever, ever pull a principal agent into a project to certify a project for practical completion if you are aware that the project is not sufficiently ready. It will always bounce back and come and bite you.
That happens to me most of the time.
Yeah.
I've been pulled into where they clearly know, and I'm being used as a snagging service. But anyway, that's my pain. So
snagging can be a very tedious process, but you can actually make it and structure it so you can get rid of the problems fairly quickly. So some notes for the client and the principal agent: you have to be able to spend time in the structure and produce a very, very, very detailed snag list. Spend the time doing it. Avoid ambiguity, supplement with, okay? And you're doing that simply because you want to avoid multiple lists. Okay. The second or third snag list, people lose, they lose motivation, they lose interest, it's dragged on for too long, it just becomes a frustrating process. Put the energy in the beginning to make sure you get your snag lists from the client and architect's perspective very conclusive. My advice from the main contractor: make it a work stream. Okay. I know you've got past the finishing line and the client may be in the house, but you know what? It's another big exercise. Put all the level of resource that you need into to get rid of it as quickly as possible. The quicker you get rid of it, the quicker you have a happy client, the quicker you get paid. Structure your snagging list in a certain kind of way so they're categorized and you can filter something out. So be able to give a particular subcontractor all the painting items. Be able to give the joinery contractor all the joinery items. Don't give them one big convoluted list that they've got to look through. That's open. Condense it. And the more you do that, the more response you will see out of the subcontractors. And then hopefully, when you've closed all of that out, you can celebrate.
Great. And that's it. And hopefully we'll end up with a real built building at the end of all this. I want to say thanks a lot to Nick for taking us through that. I've had these talks in university and they always put me asleep, but in this one I was riveted because I understand what you're talking about, and I've lived through multiple projects where what you mentioned, all those risks I've actually experienced, and I realize how important it is to manage that stuff with foresight and experience. So I know it's now a little bit past our usual end of the webinar, but if anyone in the audience has some questions for Nick, I think let's hear them now. We have from someone, Ben says, thanks, good project reminder points, great lecture, Nick. Awesome. I also thought it was really helpful and a good reminder of quite a few choices that we actually have. And I think what I find refreshing about what you're talking about is that the approach I've experienced recently the most is kind of a huge time pressure applied and almost like, lots of risk put onto the professional team and contractor, and those aren't necessarily the smartest ways to procure a building when you are informed and you know what you're doing. Oliver, thanks, Nick, very informative. Yeah, Oliver is the guy who drew that house that I've shown you. So he's very vested in this process too. As we all know, it's fun to draw stuff, but at some stage, that has to translate into 3 dimensions. What I wanted to ask you, Nick, is how in public works this gets applied, if you had any experience. I know we're talking about private residences, but in public work there is such a set way to do things. Have you had any experience in that realm?
Look, I haven't dealt with public works at all in South Africa, okay. And even the extent of my involvement in projects in public procurement has been quite limited. I mean, my time in the Middle East, so I worked for Dubai World, one of their subsidiaries, Nakheel PJSC, which in Dubai, at the time that I was there, they were the biggest land developer in the UAE. And so a lot of the stuff that we dealt with was largely public related. But again, the nature of the funding of the projects, how things were dialed out in terms of the rate at which and the rate at which they wanted to get things complete, and really the scale, they brought in many sort of international companies to assist in that process. So we weren't generally governed by the constraints that we have in this country of, like, in my opinion, quite fractured procurement kind of methods, very complex sort of restrictions in terms of eligible criteria, BE, etc., things like that. So generally my experience all parallels that I can draw with a South African context are quite limited. The reality is that many of these systems work and they're tried and tested. For some reason, a lot of the traditional methods just don't work here.
Yeah, and so ending on that slide of the big house, you were speaking about the 2-phase approach. So if you could just summarize that for us in just a few sentences. So we basically, as architects, we're in the middle of stage 2. How would it move forward now? If we were
so look, generally under a 2-stage appointment, somebody like us would get involved for a stage 3 and largely a stage 4 remit. And so we would work quite closely alongside you guys, really in the design development stage, and we would bring in a number of specialists to really facilitate that. So a number of things that you would not be able to conclude designs on based on dependencies of very specialized input, we would facilitate the process. And then in the stage 4 process, generally what would happen is we would largely facilitate the assembly of either a contract budget, a cost plan, schedules of quantities, bills of quantities, depending on what sort of cost reimbursement mechanism was arranged. And we would, our deliverable ultimately at the end of stage 4 would be to facilitate a very high degree of cost certainty, to have facilitated a very conclusive design element and documentation. And really, at the end of that stage, we would be reimbursed for the work that we put in, and our deliverables would really be subject to either approval or non-approval by the client. On the basis of approval, we would then be appointed on the basis of those deliverables to construct. If we weren't successful in resolving design and being able to align design and budget, then our remit would be concluded, and the client would then have the option to then procure the work from a stage sort of 4.2 or 4.5 onwards, really up to their discretion.
Okay. But along the way, what this method opens is that you are able to make decisions early on to affect cost and function. So you
100%.
should be in a much better position than in the traditional route where you sort of hit tender with lots of provisional sums.
100%. Look, I go back to the very first slide that I demonstrated. Risk is about uncertainty. And so our involvement very early in the stage, or a contractor's involvement very early in the stage, is really just to work extensively to reduce that element of uncertainty. To make the uncertain more certain takes really reduces a risk element.
Great. Miguel has, would you bring in a contractor to review work before tender, stage 4.2? The contractor would have been appointed. And then he says, sorry, the contractor would not have been appointed. Okay, I misread that one. What you're talking about is bringing in the contractor much, much earlier than stage 4.2. So actually in stage 2. That's actually what you are suggesting in the 2-phase appointment.
Yeah, absolutely. For instance, on Nike, we were brought in probably 1/3 of the way through stage 3. Our remit was to complete all the construction issue drawings. Be quite interesting, really. I mean, I'll send you a link to all the construction drawings. But on Nike, for instance, in stage 3, we'll go even down to the level of specifying handles that go on cupboards. We will specify the diameter of holes that go in perforated panels in lockers. All of the color palettes have all fully been resolved. So to give you an example, on Nike, the day that we were appointed and construction began, I can send you copies of all the purchase orders that went out. To give you an example, disabled stair lift that had been specified, all of the bespoke lockers that we had engaged a specialist company called Metmeister to be involved with design development, their order went out. Bespoke punching bags, only one company that does them in South Africa with quite a complex graphic printing arrangement, their order went out. The reality is I only need those products, or only needed those products, in 8 months' time. But the fact of the matter is I was able to fixate cost, able to identify storage, and I got one big number of elements of worry that you normally worry about much later on the project. They were off my desk. And yeah, so it's the ability to do that, which is vitally important. So really, during the construction phase, you are seldom contending with design and procurement related constraints. Most of it has been resolved. The things that remain unresolved are maybe some snag design items. For instance, the Nike project's interesting, but we got about 160 tons worth of very, very, very complicated decorative structural steel on the outside of the building. That entire process was resolved before we even started on site, ready to place orders. But we came up with a couple of snags during the process. Certain connection joints, being able to get bolts into very, very, very confined spaces. So those were the kind of things that we're contending with. That's very manageable. Trying to develop the entire design during the construction phase is almost impossible. So those were typical examples. The Nike project is interesting because the project is procured from Nike International outside of their European office. The whole PM team is Hills International. I've worked with them once or twice in the past in the UK. When they came to South Africa and shortlisted a number of contractors, they quizzed us on two-stage arrangements and how we understood our first stage obligations and what we would propose in terms of those. And I understood them very clearly, and it was on the basis that we understood exactly what we needed to achieve in stage one that we were ultimately appointed as the main contractor. But yeah, the stage one deliverables are complicated, and they're very, very, very onerous, and you have to understand about that. It's not a free slide into a second stage appointment. You've got to really shoot the lights out in the first stage.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nick. So on that note, I'd love to visit the Nike project when it's done and hear your narrative walking through the building in relation to what we're speaking about. So hopefully that could be arranged. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, anytime.
Yeah. Nick, thanks a lot for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And this is the end of